Welcome back to this special discussion on the World Children's Day. Let me bring in Ibrahim into this conversation. And Ibrahim, we're talking about the effect of COVID-19 on children. So we've handled matters quality education, we've handled matters rights of the children when it comes to social media. So I'd like us to talk about quality healthcare treatment during this time of COVID-19. And even as you give us your response on that, kindly also tell us whether children are way safer in schools or at home when it comes to their health.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. I think that's a very interesting question as to whether they are safer in schools or at home. But I think the answer would depend on the school or the home where they are. There are certain homes where probably they would be more secure as opposed to schools. There are certain schools where, again, they will probably be more safer as compared to homes. But back to the question around access to healthcare. I mean, when you look at healthcare, there are a lot of components of healthcare. In the context of children, maybe we might want to begin with access to what we call routine services like vaccination and immunization. During this COVID period, we've seen a lot of compromise. I mean, some of these some of these services being compromised. I know of parents who have been extremely apprehensive of taking their children for routine services, particularly on aspects of vaccination, because there has been this general notion that hospitals are actually not safe, because most of the COVID patients actually, that would be the first port of call for most of the patients. So you'd find parents also getting a bit apprehensive, not just because of the healthcare provision, I mean, not because of the facilities, but also the personnel involved. Because again, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of COVID-19 taking a lot of toll on service providers. So this COVID-19 has actually resulted to parents particularly fearing accessing routine services like vaccination, immunization, etc. There are other aspects around hospitals, availability of medical personnel. We've seen I mean, when a survey was done across the counties, we saw there were a lot of counties that were not prepared. And in fact, the government explained that the purpose of the lockdown was to ensure that counties, beef up their health resources so that we have enough, ICU bed capacity, we have ventilators and so forth and so on. So we've had challenges with that. And at the third level also, we've had a lot of challenges with, what I would call industrial action threats. As we sit here today, we know that doctors have issued a 21-day strike notice. I think that expires sometime around 6th of December. And we want to implore upon the government to actually get into, serious negotiations with the Association of Doctors and that of nurses so that they don't down their tools. Because you can imagine if doctors downed their tools during this very difficult time, the kind of effect that would have on not just access to healthcare for children, but for the entire, populace. Now, the only positive thing that we had well, not positive, but the only good side for children was that there was this notion that children, I mean, looking at even the fatality rates, children are not highly affected because we know that the virus is actually affecting more of the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions. But that does not give us the blanket check to actually say that children can then, be exposed just because research shows that the virus does not have a severe effect on children. I think the more reason why we should actually protect children. And so, just to sum it up all, there is no right or wrong answer in terms of the best place where children could be, whether it's in schools or in homes, because it depends on the nature of the school, and it also depends on, the nature of the home. But if the government was to put in place the measures that were recommended by the task force that actually looked at the possibility of reopening schools, then those measures, if those measures were put in place and implemented to the latter, then schools would be a very good place for children to be. Thank you.
So, Pauline, during this discussion, there's something that we'll always we'll keep on mentioning, and that is substance abuse, rape, and child trafficking during this conversation. I know you've also touched on that before, but then COVID-19, effect of COVID-19 on children is one of them is introduction to drug abuse. And when I look at Children's Act, Chapter 144, it actually also gives the child a protection in terms of being protected from substance abuse. And during this time of COVID-19, bars were closed before they were reopened. Some parents were taking alcohol in front of their children. Families where probably drugs are being used, some children are also being introduced to that. So when it comes to the protection of the child, how can this be handled during this time of COVID-19?
Brenda, and maybe just to add on what my two colleagues have mentioned, drug and substance abuse, we do have institutions in the country. For example, we have NACADA, and this may be part of their role just to raise awareness and do mass campaigns about the issue. But also we need to ask ourselves, why are these children or young people abusing the drugs, and to fill in that gap, because there has to be a reason why they're abusing the drugs. Is it about access? They are easily accessible. Is it because they're trying to mask something, the mental health aspects? So it's going back to assess what are these gaps that these young children are actually facing, and for us to deal with the gaps and the root causes of those gaps so that we can now tackle the issue from that aspect. But definitely bringing on board different players and partners, like I've just mentioned about NECADA, to raise awareness and campaigns on those issues. But I also mentioned about the social protection, the community-based structures. For example, when I talked about the cash transfers, it's all about looking at it also from the poverty aspect. Are the families able to take care of their children? If not, reinforcements need to be done or made towards supporting these families. Because if I'm not able to work, I'll probably go seek and solace in taking bang or alcohol, abusing different kinds of drugs. So it's also looking at it from that perspective of the family as well. Are they able to take care of themselves? I could be abusing drugs because my parents are not able to work, so I engage in prostitution, and as a result of that, I'm also abusing those drugs. So it's a whole chain of assessing the root causes and finding different ways to respond to that. Maybe just to also bring in another angle towards guidelines. Now that we have the pandemic and we do not know how long this is going to take. And I'm also looking at it from the protection perspective that you have mentioned about. And just to mention that now that we have an emergency on board, how well are we prepared to look at child protection in the aspect of emergencies? And yes, I appreciate that the Department of Children's Services and the National Council for Children's Services have come together and last with other key stakeholders to draft the child protection in emergencies guidelines to support us in moving forward how we respond to issues of emergencies, COVID being one of them amongst the other different ones. But moving forward, even as we have these discussions at the national level, and just like Ibrahim was mentioning, the task force that has been put in place, the concerns related to child protection and children matters must also be prioritized by the different task forces. So we have the education response, we have the ones looking at health, we have the ones looking at restriction on movement, but all this, there's an aspect of child protection that also has to be brought on board and bring in that angle to ensure that the violations we are talking about, the gaps I'm actually trying to raise, are also looked into, because the ripple effect when you look at the health, when we look at the education, mental issues, they all fall back to the children. So it's to just prioritize the child protection concerns at the national level and bring in that angle towards all these task forces that are looking at these matters.
All right, and you know, let me just remind all of us that I'm so sure when we were beginning this conversation, at some point we mentioned something to do with some of the laws that have been put in place. And I want us now to shift our focus and dwell on part 2 of Safeguards for the Rights and Welfare of the Children of the Act. And when I'm talking about the Act, I'm talking about the Children's Act, Chapter 141. And this caught my attention. One of the a section of the Act says about protection. That is Section 2, Section 14 actually says that, and it is the subsection talks about protection from harmful cultural rights. The reason as to why this caught my attention is that it says that no person shall subject a child to female circumcision, early marriage, or cultural rites, customs, or traditional practices that are likely to have negative effects on a child. Yet we see the government, if I may say so, I stand to be corrected, tolerating some cultural practices, such as some of the cultural practices that we witness also in out in the Western region, when it comes to male circumcision, when it also comes to female circumcision, something that also the government is fighting right now in the Rift Valley region. I'll go to Job.
Thank you, Brenda, for that. And let me say that if you look at the Constitution, it talks about if there is any culture that is going against the Constitution, then that is not it's not correct in law. And you've mentioned broadly about FGM in that, and we have various communities that practice FGM. And it's true, it's detrimental to the girls who experience this. And we have a blessing from the president. He pronounced that we were really looking forward to eradicate FGM in the next few years. And I think that is a level of commitment that we're getting from the government. However, you also mentioned that then, quote in quotes, the government is tolerating this kind of practice within the communities that does that.
Job, let me
the law is there.
Job, let me correct what I said, that the government seems to be tolerating, if you allow me to say so. What I said was female circumcision is something that the government is fighting against, and that is something that the government has even put a commission in place to handle matters to do with female circumcision. What I'm talking about in terms of that might seem like the government is tolerating is male circumcision, the rite passage, especially what you usually see in Western regions, the Western region rather.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I think I'll still maybe weigh in onto the FGM. I think maybe what has also been experienced during the COVID-19 before I come to the rite of passage for the male. I think we've seen in the areas we work in where there are a number of children who have been exposed to FGM during this time. Then they're in school. They're not in school, but they're at home. I think there's an opportunity that this practice has found a way to continue the same practice. Having said that, what we are trying to talk about in terms of male rites of passage, and one of them is the circumcision, that historically, really, that there's some issues that came up in terms of medical perspective, that it prevents or protects infection of HIV for a number of percentage. And so some communities went into doing the practice. But having said that, we always have advocated for an alternative rites of passage, so that then we are not exposing the young children to the same rights that we hold dearly within ourselves. So we engage a lot with the custodians of these rights, so that then we'll be able to help them to employ some other rites of passage. But generally, we've not had any concern around the rites of passage for boys being something that we can talk about to help campaign about stopping that. But of course, they have other concerns about it that we might talk about and help to talk about, have a conversation with the custodian of the rights, the community gatekeepers, and the elders within those communities.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have only, if I may say so, if I'm not wrong, I think my director told me 6 minutes, and after Job has completed his sentiment, I think we're remaining with 5 minutes. So I'd like us to divide those 5 minutes equally, amongst the three of you. And so let me go to Ibrahim. Ibrahim, laws, yes, have been put in place by the government to protect the girl, I was about to say the girl child, to protect the children. But then you also have controversial bills that have been introduced on the floor of the House that parents and especially religious leaders feel like this is not the right time to introduce such kind of bills. We're talking about the reproductive health care bill that caused a lot of uproar, especially when it came to abortion, and also talking about sex education and introduction, just teaching children about abortion in primary school. I'll go to Ibrahim.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda, for the question. I think the discussion around reproductive health rights and sex education and all that needs to be put in a particular context. And whereas religious leaders are opposed to it, I think it's critical to note that a lot of this education is already happening and has been happening over time. Because if you asked any class 5 child, they'll tell you that they're already learning a lot of things in science around the body. I mean, the body of a human being, the male body, the female body, and so forth and so on. If you get to biology, right from Form 1 to Form 4, children are already learning on some of these aspects. So what is of importance, I think, in my view, is to unpack what we mean by reproductive reproductive rights. In any event, the Constitution under Article 43 already talks of, reproductive rights. So it's a discussion that we cannot wish away. The only thing that I would urge the community in general is to unpack what we actually mean, so that we do not, compromise with what Pauline called the best interest of the child. All these discussions that are happening are supposed to be in the best interest of the child. So going back to the proposed legislations, I think it is important for us to, begin asking ourselves whether or not those legislations were actually in the best interest of the child. And number two, the content of, when we talk about the sort of sex education that needs to be introduced in schools, what does it exactly mean? What is the content of that? Now, the other controversial aspect has been around distribution of, some of the commodities that are involved in reproductive rights to children. And I think that's where the controversy is, because I would be very uncomfortable if you gave my 5 or 4-year-old daughter some of those maybe condoms or whatever they are. But in the context of looking at where we are as a country, I think it's important to put all those things and unpack and ask ourselves, what do we mean? What is the content of our reproductive rights?
All right.
Yeah.
So we've come at the end of this production, but then I'd just like to request my producing director for just a minute, because I need to get the final sentiments of Pauline in just a minute. Pauline, rescue centers have been seen as a safe haven for children, but some of these rescue centers are also turning to be a place where children are actually molested and mistreated. In a minute.
So basically monitoring to ensure that safeguards and protocols for children are put in place to continue to protect them, and also ensuring that when they are there for the shortest period of time, so that they are able to access the services for whatever reason that they're there. But also the other aspect of coordination, the people who play a certain role towards ensuring that these children access their services, that whole aspect of having everybody brought on board should actually be something that is considered. So the overall issue here is about ensuring that wherever children are placed, it has to be a place of safety for them, protection and safeguarding protocols must be adhered to.
All right. On that note, I'd like to say once again, asanteni sana. I had Ibrahim Alubala, Advocacy and Child Rights Governance Technical Specialist from the Save Children, and also Job Osewe, and also we had Pauline Dogo, who is a Programs Officer, Advocacy, SOS Children's Village. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for this special coverage. It comes to the discussion about children. My name is Brenda Zeda Radido. So in just in a few minutes, Grace Kuria is up next with the news desk as she brings you up to date with what is making the headlines in the country and beyond. So enjoy the rest of your viewing. Let's all keep safe and protect our children.